I learned to love science as a student, especially chemistry. I developed a passion for breath, actually. My English literature teacher thought I should become a lawyer. She felt I was wasting my brain on science because I really enjoyed debates. I enjoyed many of the things that you might associate with someone who would pursue a non-scientific track.
Hello, Molly here on the Say It Skillfully podcast and the 43rd feature episode of Our Voices, an in-depth look into life journeys you may find quite unexpected. I encourage you to listen with an open mind to this account of what it means to grow up, struggle, learn, work, and live in our world. Born and raised in Guyana, my guest brings a deeply global and human perspective to leadership, shaped early by curiosity, resilience, and a belief in the power of education to change lives. That experience shows up in how he approaches engineering today, not as an abstract discipline, but as a practical force for solving real problems and expanding opportunity. He earned a PhD in chemical engineering, is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and is globally recognized for research advancing next-gen energy storage, earning top honors from the National Science Foundation, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, and recognition as one of the world's most influential scientific minds in material science. Under his leadership, engineering has become more collaborative, outward-looking, and impact-driven, guided by a rare combination of rigor, humility, and a long view of progress. I am delighted to welcome Cornell University's Dean of the Duffield College of Engineering and Distinguished Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, Lynden Archer. Lynden, welcome to Our Voices.
Thank you, Molly. I know it's been a long time in the making. Thanks for having.
Well, it's really my thanks to you because I have had the privilege of serving on the Engineering College Council through some deans. We have become friends. You are one of my idols for how you lead. And I really am grateful for that because I think the folks I've talked to when they take on a deanship, it's sort of like, well, I got to do that. I was asked, I can't say no, right? I mean, so it's an opportunity to serve, right? You have really embraced it in a way where I have to tell you, it seems very natural to you to be leading this way. So I'm really grateful for listeners will hear a little bit more about that. But what I'm really keen, Lynden, is for people just to get a chance to get to know you. You know, you're very polished. You shared a lot about the school and the work, but I think you have a really exciting background, and thank you for sharing it with us.
All right. No, thank you. Yeah. So thanks for the kind introduction, Molly. As you said at the outset of this show, my story is as unlikely as they come. And, just to preview a little bit, you mentioned humility. And I think that is sort of the core of where I think, this leadership with humility comes from. So I grew up, as you said, in Guyana, almost in a different era, different world. At the time, of course, Guyana was not the oil-rich country that it is today. And so I grew up to a dad who was a police officer and a mom who was a homemaker. Neither of them had a college degree, but both of them kind of understood the importance of education and instilled it in me as a core value, that just the opportunity to learn, to be curious, to enable that curiosity by learning more. It was really something that, I trace back to my earliest childhood days. And so, I give my dad and mom equal credit, but my mom was a force of nature. So as someone who didn't have a college degree, she just kind of understood in a way that is really just amazing to me this day, what it could open up, what opportunities it could open up. So from the earliest days, I had a tiger mom who didn't have a lot of means, but had a lot of drive. And she, worked very hard, and I would say in a very smart way to live in some sense vicariously through myself and my brothers who, turns out four of them are engineers. So she really did a number, not just on me, but on some of my siblings. But at any rate, so the journey started early. So it started with preschool in the neighbor's yard, just having somebody who knew how to teach. Such that when I got to primary school, I was a little bit ahead all the time and skipped a lot of grades very fast and sort of promptly, at the very end, so many grades skipped, landed, out of my depth. Let's put it that way, right? So there was a lot of catching up to do, not because I was behind, but I had just maybe been pushed too hard. And so in that process, discovered the value of again just being humble, right? I was smart, but then I'm tossed in with students who were much better prepared. But that setting that aside, so I was able to get a scholarship at age 11 to the top secondary school in the country, and that's quite a story, right? So they would, at 11 years old, you took this exam called the Common Entrance Exam. I think it's similar to things that are done in Hong Kong and perhaps even Singapore, very British in origins. And so I took this exam, knowing it's important, but not fully appreciating that it's a sorting kind of thing that basically streamed you almost right away to the top schools. And I was lucky to have gotten one of the top schools. And I'm happy to go into more detail, but that was the starting point. They say I got a chance to run with the thoroughbreds because coming out of my last year in in primary school with those kids, like I said, that were better prepared, I landed at a top high school with kids who were all very prepared and all used to being the first in their class. So that was quite an experience, and just a little bit of an anecdote in terms of lessons that came out of that continue to live with me today. That as over time, I would say increased my respect for my mom. Right. So so in the secondary school I entered, classes were divided up into groups of roughly about 42 or so students. And in my first report, remember I told you that these are the top students in the country at the time, right? In my first report card, I had spaced 13th out of 42. And I was happy because I thought, gosh, the best of the best. I went to normal, humble, government school, and many of these kids went to fancy schools and all that. I was really happy with that. And to top it off, my best friend had brought 41st, 42nd. So I thought, gosh, and he was a smart guy, so that must be just fine, right? But my mom didn't quite see it that way. So she wanted to know who brought first, who brought second, and what did they do that I didn't do. And that, Molly, was an eye opener. It really made me more introspective to think about, how I can become better as a person, as a student, frankly, in life. And that lesson sticks with me to today because it came out of nowhere, right? You're a happy kid going along, and then somebody tells you, you're not working hard enough. And that was the last time she had to say it because once she did, I got the message and it was really guns blazing, all engines on fire from that point on. So that was the high school experience. I learned to love science as a student, especially chemistry. I developed a passion for breath, actually. My English literature teacher thought I should become a lawyer. She felt I was wasting my brain on science because I really enjoyed debates. I enjoyed many of the things that you might associate with someone who would pursue a non scientific track. But I took all of that, right? And so ultimately, when I came to university, so I came to USC, University of Southern California, at age 18. I really was just like it was like what I say? It was like I'm a kid in a candy store because there was just so much great science, so much great liberal studies, and you can take it all, and you can do research too, right? As an undergrad, so it was just amazing. I had a blast at USC and finished, not feeling like I'd had enough, and had a really nice opportunity to finish up my doctoral work at Stanford. And that was another kind of blast because at the time, Stanford had the perspective that they wanted to develop well rounded PhDs, and so, quarter system. And so you were encouraged to take as many courses as you could. And I took them. I took a lot of courses. And to this day, I look back on that as really kind of rounding out the technical side, my core, that gives me a certain, confidence to pursue new things. So it's quite a journey from there to here, but one that hopefully you can see, right, is sort of connected by, that parent who not just instilled a value of education, but is really, dogged in saying, this is an opportunity. I want you to be the best at that opportunity as you can. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, let me start. We're going to continue, but let me ask about the brothers because there's a whole cadre of engineers. So, what was the influence? What was the dynamic with the brothers?
Well, I've got a number of brothers, and I'm going to leave that as a mystery, but I've got a number of brothers. We were all, we loved cricket. And so I would say that's a dynamic. We love cricket together. And my older brothers were just exceptional. I mean, they were different in different ways, but one in particular, my brother Glendon, who I'm going to mention here, he is a metallurgical engineer. So he went to Columbia, and he's older than me. And so he sort of blazed the trail. He kind of showed that the things my mom was saying weren't just, pie in the sky. That, you could come from our background because he had the same upbringing, the same schools, everything, and you can, hope to accomplish the things that she thought we could accomplish. And so he did a PhD at Columbia. And then I have a second after him who's a PhD in mechanical engineering. And after me, there's on who's a PhD in chemical engineering. So it's a really amazing story, not just about me, but about what a single woman who had no college training, but understood, the value of education was a value worth passing on, but then didn't stop there. It just kept pushing each of us in our own, clever, gentle way to achieve beyond what I think we would have without that type of parent.
What was it like? Because your brother paved the way to leave the country. But I
Yes.
am curious. So, did you visit a lot? I mean, it's kind of far back then. I mean, maybe now it doesn't seem, but sending your beloved child over the ocean with no cell phone, right?
Well, I think, at the time, the path was scholarship, right? And so we couldn't afford to come to USC or Columbia. And so you went to places that, in some sense, opened their doors to you. And you didn't question it, right? You understood that it's a hardship, that you're going to be far from home. We spent a lot of time passing the phone around, that, right? In the old days. And the minutes are going and the money is going, right? You know that thing. And he, in a really interesting way, showed us that even those types of hardships, the weather, the culture, and so on, were things that you can experience and thrive in. And so I think for me, I don't want to underplay my experience, but for me, it was a pretty straightforward thing to consider moving to Southern California, right? It's not New York, so we didn't have winter, right? So it was a little bit easier in a certain human sense to do that. So so my brother Glenn was really really quite an amazing person and still is, started his own business. I mean, he's done extraordinary things and continues to be a bit of a North Star to not just me, but the next generation of archers, right? Who are thinking, gosh, those guys could do it under those circumstances. How about us? So it's a wonderful way to start a conversation, Molly. I don't know how much of that about me you knew, but it's the engine I think that motivates me, but also keeps me grounded. That this is really unlikely a story as ever, and I feel a certain commitment to paying it forward.
Well, no, that absolutely shows through for your mother to have those sons, everyone just excelling. I mean, PhD is not a lightweight endeavor. And so the work ethic, the commitment is clear. I mean, just that doesn't kind of happen by accident. And I love that you really looked up to your older brother.
We have, and not to cut you, but we have one plumber in the brothers. So just just and he's fine. He's doing fine. So it's not all PhDs, but
But it is a P. Yes, a P. Well, we all know the vocational trades are such a huge need right now. To be
exactly,
honest with you,
exactly.
he's in a great place.
And he was thought to be the best plumber too, right? If that's what you're gonna do, you better excel at it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'd love to hear next the navigating of the postdoc and getting roles. And I'm curious, being from Guyana in America, how you felt, any inklings about race, and just did that ever come up for you?
It's a great question. So Guyana famously is known as the nation of six races. And so the majority race in Guyana are actually Indians from India. And then there are, Africans from Africa who were the former slaves in Guyana. The Indians came as indentured servants after slavery. So they ran the plantations and so forth. Portuguese came earlier as indentured servants to Guyana. Chinese, there's a pretty substantial population of Chinese in Guyana, and native Americans, the so-called Amerindians. And of course, they're mixed race people with all sorts of mixtures there. So I grew up in a culture where, there is identity politics and identity socialization, if I can say it, identity-based socialization. But it's one where that was superficial, right? That it's the beginning of the interaction, but then there's commonality beneath it. And so I've always expected that of people, that I've always, been able to see the person beneath the superficial thing and be open, frankly, to that person being whatever it is, right? I think there's some people who, beyond the first layer matters. And that's their prerogative if it matters. And, and there are people who it does not. And so I grew up in that sort of, not colorblind, but certainly with an awareness that everybody brings something unique to the conversation. And to the extent you could find how to get them to participate, it does create a sort of stronger unit than, if it were just one race or one culture that drove this. So I'm a big believer actually in the value of just having all voices at the table and maybe a bit of an optimist that it doesn't have to be controversial or adversarial, that there is a future where we can all learn from each other, and finding a way to do that is to me a very high priority here at Cornell.
No, well, it's clear that's how you lead. So I'm curious how you navigated PhD and who was guiding you to think about what you could do, go into industry, go into academia.
So, so one of the things that I fell in love with as an undergrad is chemical engineering, something I knew absolutely nothing about as a high school student. In fact, I came to the U.S. thinking that I wanted to be a nuclear engineer, but then discovered very quickly there weren't that many programs left by the mid 1980s when I came to school. And so I started chemical engineering and just lucked out in all sorts of amazing ways. My undergrad advisor turns out to be a Cornell alumnus, and she was like the best advisor you could ever hope for because she saw pathways for me to do things that I didn't even know I wanted to do, like research and things like that. And so she kind of guided me from day one, where I was able to start doing research on catalysis. I started working with faculty member at the time. Acid rain was a big problem in Southern California. And so we had a chromia-based catalyst that was going to oxidize the HCl to make chlorine gas, and that is a really valuable commodity. So I was seeing in the classroom chemical engineering, but in the laboratory seeing chemistry and how a deep understanding of chemistry could lead to better engineering. And that to me was really the nucleus of the decision to go to graduate school because I saw what the grad students were doing in the lab, and they were all doing different things, but all things that really provided perspective on chemical engineering that included chemistry. And that was, as I mentioned earlier, one of the core things that I liked doing as a youngster. So, funny story is I applied to many places, but really wanted to go to Stanford to work with one particular person who was the world's expert at the time in catalysis. And, I applied my essay. PhD students write an essay to describe their interest. My essay was written to that person. It was like a letter to this person I wanted to work with. He never replied, and I didn't expect a reply. I just, this is a letter, essentially, for him to just read it. I didn't really want him to respond, but at any rate, if he had responded, I would have learned that he had retired in the period between when I finished undergrad. So I landed there and didn't have the person I wanted to work with. And there was no one like him on the faculty doing the things he did. But then landed in the group of the person who became my thesis advisor, Jerry Fuller. That was just amazing, right? It was the furthest thing from chemistry, right? So it was more a physics group looking at polymers, looking at using laser light to understand the orientation of polymers is relevant to their processing, and opened up a totally new world to me. And I can go on, but that was really just luck that I landed in that group. I thrived in the group. And Jerry, as we called him, still on the faculty and still very active in research, was an amazing mentor in that he was not just a consummate faculty member, deeply entrenched in research, but also loved teaching. I mean, you can just see, when he gets in the classroom, not the best organized always, but loved what he was doing. But also at the same time, during my time in his lab, he became the department chair. And so I got to also see how you balance leadership with all the things that a faculty member does. And I would say he did it seamlessly. And that again planted a seed that there are certain career paths that one could pursue with a PhD that weren't perhaps necessarily as obvious to even my fellow students at the time.
This really is like one in one. This puts it all together. I can see how you had these role models to give you a sense of how you wanted to fill that leadership position.
Yes.
Because I would say in general that that academic-y track maybe doesn't lead to as many leadership learnings. You're focused on your research, what have you. But to have people like that, that's really crazy. Did you failure struggles? Was anything hard in this period? Was it
Well,
all,
but it was hard. There was hard stuff. Yeah, there was hard stuff. So the dialing back to undergraduate. So Kathy Shing, in her wisdom, Kathy Shing said to me, Lyndon, you can finish your undergrad degree in 3 years. You don't need to take four, because I see what your record is. The system in Guyana is very much like in Hong Kong and Singapore at the time, where you do GCA levels, and that is sort of like the first year of college so you come with a little bit of a head start. And she said, why just do it? And so that meant I was carrying a lot of credit hours, and so that was not the easiest thing, because instead of getting the A, sometimes you got an A minus, and that was a hardship. That was a hardship. Let's put it that way. Okay. With my upbringing. But then in graduate school, I think the independence was actually very interesting. That as a youngster in high school, I had to self-learn. I mean, I think we didn't have the best teachers, so you had to really challenge yourself and often set your own standards. As an undergrad, it was a little bit less on your own. I mean, we had great teachers, very caring TAs, and things like that. But in grad school, I mean, my wonderful advisor that I just said to you, right? He met me in the parking lot the summer before our qualifying exam, and he said, Lyndon, you will be studying Raman scattering. And I had never heard the word before. So that was my PhD. So that was not easy. I had to learn a lot, because it's, you're preparing for a qualifying exam. So I had to learn a lot, and I had to learn a lot fast. But in the end, that turned out to be really good, because even the things that were, sort of dead ends, right? You had to go to the library and find books. You know how that is in the old days. You find books, and the book that you're looking for, you can't find, so you end up reading another one, and you end up learning a lot of things that you didn't perhaps necessarily need to know. for the question you had, but it did again have this really interesting way of kind of planting seeds that in some cases it's many years later. When I was at Bell Labs, for example, I can kind of see that, gosh, I can use that thing that I never used before to do this thing over here. And it really did create a good environment. So struggles, yes, but not, anything extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, it's impressive. I'm wondering the work ethic piece. Did you just watch your parents and was that grooved in? I'm just wondering how you honed that just basic value of hard work.
Well, I think part of it was we didn't have the best teachers in, right? So top high school in the country, but not the best teachers, right? And I think in part because they couldn't keep the best teachers. The country was not rich. And so the very best teachers often got contracts to work elsewhere, often in Venezuela, so Venezuela's our neighbor, right, to the west, or elsewhere in the Caribbean, right? And so we didn't have the best teachers, but what we had is this really interesting tradition where the top students were kind of celebrated over time. So I knew who the top students were, 3, 4 years ahead of me. And I knew what they had done, what sort of grades they had accumulated. And that was kind of the standard and I suspect if you polled other of my classmates at the time, it was the kind of North Star for everybody that you knew, what was expected of you if you were good. And you understood that to get there, you had to really more or less do it on your own. And so I spent many nights burning the candle at both ends, as they say. I was pretty disciplined. And I think, that's one of the things that I think is probably due to my mom. I was very disciplined that I knew what I needed to do and I just did it. And that was, part of how you make it work. That it was hard, but it then created a certain, sense of, gosh, if I have the core in math and the core in chemistry and the core in physics, I can teach myself that new thing, like Raman scattering, for example, right? That is going to be so crucial to being a successful PhD. So, and then of course watching my brothers too, right? Because they had their own struggles, but a similar path. They had to do a lot of work on their own and often outside of school, right? It's usually you go to school, you do the school stuff, but then the bar is higher than what you're getting taught in the classroom. And so you had to then just get ready on your own.
How would you describe how competitive you are?
I used to be more competitive. How about that? And I think with that, that first experience that I told you about, where my friend who got first, I suddenly saw that friend as like, God, what did that person do? It wasn't, this is my buddy, I could support them. And so that created a certain sense of, comparing yourself, if I can say that way. And that, I think that is good to a certain degree. I know nowadays it's not maybe something people embraced as much with young kids, but it certainly did create in me an awareness, let's say, of, what other people were doing who were doing better. And instead of envying them or being angry at them or whatnot, it sort of defined, what it is that I should be doing or could be doing if I wanted to do the things they're doing or perhaps do them even better. So I am competitive in a certain sense, but I've learned that it's not enough, right? Right. You've got to support people who are great and not care that they're better than you are. How about that?
Big words, sounds good. Not so easy to do sometimes. We all
Not,
know that.
I know, but I would say when you're on a team, Molly, where you commit the effort to chart a course together and you've sort of defined, where we're going together, I think it helps because then you can begin to see that everybody on the team doesn't have to excel in the same way. And that, I think that is important, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Did you learn that from cricket?
I don't know. It's something you have to learn on cricket, but there it's enforced on you because in cricket there, different positions. that you play. And so if you're the wicket keeper, you have a certain skill set. If you're the bowler, you have a certain skill set. And so there you're kind of put in your position and you execute in that position. But here it's, you kind of choose which positions you're good at, who's better at those things. You recruit them, you mentor them, you give them the freedom to be successful in those roles. And you recognize, or realize that if the team is successful, then everybody on the team succeeds.
Well, that's what we would hope. So tell me about your work experience before you went back into academia.
So, I never left academia, and I should be clear that Bell Labs is perceived to be private sector, but at the time it was really maybe the best place to do academic research. So I was at Murray Hill in New Jersey, and I spent only a year there, so it was actually more like a postdoc as opposed to a full-time job. It had the trappings of a job in that, you came in at a certain time and you were supposed to leave at a certain time. But I was again surrounded by people who were just overachievers. I mean, these are the best of the best. And a number of Nobel Prizes were won at that lab. And so there's a certain culture there that was a really good proving ground, I would say, for when I did come back as a professor, because I certainly had the perspective of a Stanford, where you're balancing research and teaching as a faculty member, and in the case of my advisor, leadership, to the labs where people are like just pure researchers. And right, and that's a very different lifestyle, very different value system, and it was all kind of influential in its own ways.
Yeah. And so so that was a given year, and then how did you decide to do what did you do after that?
Well, so I had this crazy idea, Molly, that I was not gonna ever be an academic, even after all of that. Isn't that like the craziest thing? So it's like I'm hardwired in a certain way. And I think at the time, I just maybe because my advisor was so good, I thought, oh my God, I could never be as good as an academic as he was. And so I thought maybe I'll go to the private sector. And so I did a lot of interviews, right? I interviewed with everybody. I would think I killed it every time I interviewed, but never got an offer from any company, right? And so, I mean, now, of course, in hindsight, I was a foreign student at the time. At the time, I, of course, didn't appreciate the complexity because as a foreign student with pretty decent English language skills, had come up through USC. So I was kind of, educated in America for most of my college life. And so I maybe wasn't as honest with myself. Let's put it that way. So all the doors closed. Every single one closed. And then the academic jobs are very nice. They were really like, come on, interview, right? My first interview, I got an offer, like right on the spot. And it just felt like a calling. And so to this day, I tell people who will listen, including my children, that closed doors provide direction too, right? That sometimes something shuts
Yeah.
in your face and you think it's for you and it isn't for you. And you find a path that is actually, frankly, the path you were actually on and should be on. And that was my story that I came to academia somewhat reluctantly. But as you said earlier, really have enjoyed, being in this world.
So this the academic world, people talk about office politics, and the academic world I think could run circles around that. You have learned to use your voice. Your communication is spectacular. So was that modeled by someone? And then as you came into the academic environment, I feel that you maybe didn't get tempted to kind of behave the way that perhaps people think stereotypically it is a little bit more dog eat dog, not necessarily as collaborative, but you seem to have really leaned into what you believe. So just tell us a little bit about that.
So again, I'm going to connect another thread going all the way back, right? So my high school, there were many different tracks. So there's the academic track, there's a sports track, and then there's a leadership track. And so I was elected the head prefect in high school. So I already kind of had, even then, this sort of tap on the shoulder from my peers that, you had something to offer beyond the things that you did in the classroom. I mean, and that was really formative, right? In that at that time I didn't know much, but yet you had to give speeches and things, right? And it was a elite school. And also and there was no chatbot to help you, right? So you had to really, be original. You had to be sometimes extemporaneous, where you just call up and you've got to speak on things. And I was a debater, so I kind of learned to be concise and to also get a point through. So that, I think that is the thread that I believe you're tugging on. That really gave me a certain sense that there's satisfaction that you can gain by doing things that benefit not just you, right? And that I feel that very deeply. In fact, that satisfaction is superior in my mind to the satisfaction you get from your own advancement because it really does, allow you to contribute to things that are hugely impactful, much more impactful than one can ever be as an individual.
Well, I think that speaks to the heart of Say It Skillfully, which is the being truly grounded in oneself. Grounded, not necessarily meaning that we're the most fabulous thing in the world, but truly knowing that you'll be okay. And that when you have that sensibility, it does free one to be able to think about others and what can we
Yes.
do for the greater good. And you just kind of ooze that in spades. Along the way here, you have this better half. I'm curious personally, how did you weave in your personal life with this shockingly academic turn of events?
So my wife, who I think you're referring to, Siobhan. So Siobhan and I met in high school, and we mentioned hardships, and that was an interesting hardship in its own right. So we met in high school and kind of knew almost right away that there was just a sort of click, and right that there was just a shared value system. We will talk for hours, and she also studied chemical engineering, and so we had similar technical interests. But she was the top student in the school, so I was a year above her. So we didn't compete. So she was top for her class. How about that? And so she went to Cambridge in England to do her undergraduate work. And so Southern California, Cambridge, how do you keep that spark going? And so that was a bit of a challenge because in those days it would be $80 for a 30-minute phone call, right? So no family and friends minutes in those early days, right? And often you have to hang up the phone in the middle of when you're talking about something important because you couldn't afford to keep chatting. But we sort of discovered over time that she loved the warmth of Southern California, and I loved the dark dreary of Cambridge at Christmas time. And so I would go that way for Christmas. She would come to California in the summer, and we just grew together in an interesting way. And then she, of course, came to do her PhD in chemical engineering at UC Davis. So I was able to, again, we did the same thing, but again, shorter distances across the bay. And and I think that was just amazing how we just kept in touch, grew together, and I think our kids might disagree, but we don't argue about a lot of stuff. We're really kind of simpatical. So the ultimate partner in sort of getting what I do, understanding the challenges, and knowing a lot of stuff I don't know. And that then helps me, in leading the college to sort of have a broader perspective on, the community of educators, right? She's a so-called research, teaching, and extension faculty member. So these are non-tenured faculty in the college. And I was a tenure track faculty member. Very different tracks, very different expectations. But as dean, it takes all of those to do a great job educating students. That perspective has been really amazing. And I will add, obviously we had two amazing children, both Cornellians, which is its own special thing. And being able to see those two kids grow up in some interesting way with my mother's values, right? My mother's commitment to education without pushing. So I never pushed them as hard and they'll disagree, but I never pushed them as hard as my mom push me. And I think it's because Siobhan and I were pushing, guiding, mentoring, developing them in our own, let's say more, more evolved, if I could say like those words, evolved ways that, resonated with, the culture in which they grew up.
Yeah. Listen, raising kids for a world that one doesn't know, I mean, that's parenting is the ultimate. As you reflect on being a parent, what did, having your kids teach you, or what were some of the ways you noticed that you grew by being a parent?
Well, so we had kids when I was like chasing tenure, right? So that, as you know, is the first major gate in academia. And so those early days were not straightforward. Like when a child has an ear infection, they don't want them at school. So you've got to now on a fever, you got a crown. Yeah. And so it really taught me how to balance that, to work from home, the things that you've got to sort of be flexible about, to say I can't do it, to say no, right? To things that you perhaps had committed to because, you were needed to do something else. It also, taught me never to try to teach my children technical things. It's just really, really amazing. I taught high school students in the past and thought I can teach my kids tricks and math and so on. And I would teach them and they would go to school and the teacher would say, nope, that's not the way I want you to do it. And I learned very quickly that it's best to just let them, learn in their own at their own pace in the structure of their teachers, because that ends up being less contentious. And then obviously watching them navigate through Cornell was its own journey, right? In teaching me the importance of just having professors who are committed to developing people, right? There's nothing like seeing your children reflect back to you what things are like in the classrooms that you brag about. And, sometimes they exceed expectations, but sometimes they don't. And just really, that was really just special. That's watching them, on the one hand, grow at Cornell. I mean, it was just brilliant, for example, to see my daughter come home after her sophomore year and insist that I use references at a dinner table when I'm saying controversial things. What is your reference, Daddy? Right. So that was incredible to see how she just changed the confidence, the breadth, the depth, and she's still like that to this very day. It was amazing, likewise, to see my son develop a group of friends. I mean, that are all engineers, all driven, that are lifelong friends. I mean, they're like buddies even to now. They come to San Francisco, they're all hanging out together. And, obviously, as someone who left all my friends behind coming to college, just watching that sort of thread of connectivity between my kids. And I mean, it's really been wonderful seeing their lives developed in ways that mine obviously couldn't because of where I started.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
spectacular. Being tapped to become dean, I'm just curious about your academic career path as you came in tenure, fighting for the tenure. Was that something you ever were in doubt? Was that just a matter of I just got to push through it?
Yeah. And it's, I had great students. I think that's where I would start. I had great students from day one. And I had very good instincts, about what questions to ask that aren't completely divorced from what people already know, but bring to bear all the stuff I was taking in those Stanford courses in a way that I could add perspective that, they didn't have. And so I was lucky in that way. So my first student was a superstar, an amazing student from India that we did very good work together. And that sort of laid a foundation that made it such that I was not worried when it came to tenure, because the very first set of work we did got a lot of attention, including from a Nobel laureate in physics who reviewed one of our papers. And in the peer review process, usually was supposed to be anonymous, but he decided to contact us, talk about what we were doing because he felt like there was something fresh and exciting here. And he ended up, of course, being one of my tenure letter writers later on. So it was, and it's the students. I started with three students, and they were all different, but all really kind of driven in their own ways. And that then lays a nice foundation, Molly, that once you start with great students, they seem to attract students and they recruit. I mean, it was just this kind of energizing system of talent that I benefited from. And as a result, some of the accolades you mentioned early at the beginning, they were really my students just extending, let's say, my and their imagination, to do things that the field needed to see done.
Think there's a laws of attraction thing happening there for sure. So the idea of being dean, okay, so is that something we aspire to when we're teaching? Is it like, oh my gosh, don't pick me? I'm curious how this kind of came upon, and then it does seem from my very far away perspective that it really does land for you. Like it does not seem like an unnatural act in the slightest.
That's very generous, Molly, but it wasn't always that way, right? So I always knew, like I said, that I had this kind of leadership thing that I would always want to talk to people, always want to, just bring people together to do things. I was the head at undergrad of my AICHE student chapter, so that continued on. And so when I became a faculty member, at Texas A&M. So I started my academic career at Texas A&M. They wanted to create a new institute on polymer film blowing. This is, the garbage bags and things, the plastic bags. They're made by a process where you inject hot air in the center of a molten plastic and it swells out like a balloon. And you then cool it down, and that's how you get the very thin film. And so I was at a very young age, I was put responsible for the chemical engineering component. So that was a lot of responsibility. And so there were always this, thread of doing things for the benefit of a bigger cause than yourself. And that led me, of course, to Cornell, where I, again, became the chair of chemical engineering, got to interact actually before I became chair with a previous occupant of this role, Ken Fox, who was an incredible human being and someone who I respected a lot. And so certainly saw the deanship as a place where a value-centered individual could really make change in a way that impacted, people up and down the professional ladder. So I saw the impact he had, and I think maybe he saw my potential, and so he kept putting me on committees that I was a little bit maybe too junior to be on these. But I got to see the bar as to what it was, what it took, and what impact one could have. And as department head in chemical engineering, I just discovered the alumni. It's something that faculty don't know to their discredit. That we we graduate terrific people, and as the head of a department, you can kind of shape the future of those people by the things you're enabling in the present. And that to me was like, wow, that right, that it's not look to the left, look to the right kind of thing
No.
that many of our alums were educated with, but it's a much more mentoring, much more nurturing environment, and one that if you do it right, you can graduate even more engaged, more loyal, more committed students who are above all else having great impact in the world. And so that was, I think, what set it up for me, just seeing that there's this dimension to leadership that where in the present time you can impact the future through people, that it was just wow. And so, of course, being dean, it's even bigger. You can do it not just in one department, but across departments. And that's what we've been attempting to do in the college, how to, in our time, take control of the things we can control, and it's not everything, but to do it in a way that really does develop the people who I think will matter for the future deans, and they're looking back at who we've graduated and what they've done.
Yeah. What have been the biggest challenges that you have encountered in your tenure, and how has that helped you to grow?
So and so there are a lot, but I'll try to come to the ones that are most recent, right? Because that is, so I think the hardest challenges for me come from places where you think you understand, right? You think you understand, and you may even have a strategy that's built on that presumption of understanding. And then you actually don't, you know, you don't understand, right? And then you've got to really pivot and move. And when you're in a leadership role, there's a whole team that you sort of bring along, with that understanding. And the concrete example, I should say one concrete example of that is what we've gone through in the last year in institutions like Cornell, right? Where, we had a certain awareness that there's this trifecta of missions, right? Educating students, doing creative work in research, and translating that work out into the world to have impact. So that's kind of how we were brought up. And as a new dean, I'm a numbers person, so I was able to sort of look at where, we can do better. And it just felt like the research domain was one where we need to concentrate, and in particular, to diversify our funding portfolio from NSF, NIH, and things like. And so we executed on that, and as as was in the news, we encountered a lot of hardship in the last year to challenge that thought process. And to a certain extent, even though much of that is behind us, it was still that kind of wake up moment, right? Where you have to really think through, what are we really here to do as an institution, right? And what are the things that are truly indispensable? And I think this business of developing people has become ingrained in the community as something we need to aspire to do well, to do better, and to do it in a kind of distinctive way that ultimately creates a culture where, that's what we expect of each other.
Yeah, that's spectacular. What, when you think about what's ahead for you as a dean, what's most exciting?
But there's a lot out there. I think you started by mentioning we're now the Cornell Duffield College of Engineering, and there's a new story that goes with that name change. But there's also, a an expectation, right? I think, when you read the comments that Dave Duffield made in, saying what influenced his decision to do this, there are several threads, right? So one is his own experience as a student here, and it's not just the rigor and all the things Cornell is known for, but the kind of humanity of a couple of faculty members that he worked with who were inspiring to him. He mentioned Dick Conway as one. And these are both ORIE faculty members. But he also mentioned his experience working with Cornell students, hiring them and seeing how just well prepared they are across the generations to solve hard problems. And then, he and I share a common view about the sort of competence of infrastructure, that you can say you're wonderful, but if your infrastructure is doing things that are last century, there's an so there's a lot to do and to continue to build here. And I'm really excited about stewarding that new massive investment that's going to give us the resources to do some of it to an outcome that, we can truly kind of look back and say that, this was a sort of consequential moment in the college's history where we were able to build things that outlive all of us, right, in terms of their impact. So that is, that's the thing in front of me, Molly, and just kind of doing that well is, we're already thinking about how to execute that to high standards.
Yeah. It's so important to be able to unify and bring different groups together. And, you know, communicating, there's students and there's the academic environment, but being able to get out there to corporations and to other stakeholders. I'm curious if you have any learnings as you've been going through this, whether it's talking to people who can donate or what have you. Just, anything you might share with our audience about what helped you to feel like you could connect with people who may be coming from different places with very different information or different ideas.
That's one place I would say it's still work in progress. I think that historically, I've not been heavily funded by companies, or college or university, frankly, has not been perhaps as successful as some of our peers in securing long-term, relationships with companies. So we're learning that you've got to deliver value fast, right? Because ultimately, an investment from a company is just that. It's an investment. You've got to make connections around people. There's got to be a certain sense that even before the whatever the product is, you're helping to improve, refine, innovate. The people that are doing that innovation could be employees of that company. So we've got to think about that too. And we also have to think in my own experience of the kind of the virtuous cycle of, working on research projects that are actually, driven by application, right? I think there's a certain, tradition in academia to think of applied questions as questions that are somehow less, intellectual than the sort of fundamental questions. But in reality, I think that the, applied questions often have the benefit of an impact built in. There's a product that is vetted in a market, and if it's improved, it could be used in a bigger market that can improve lives if it's in the medical space, and so on, right? So that, so, but to solve these problems, to fill the gaps in knowledge, they're very hard problems. They're very hard technical problems. And what we've seen is that when PhD students, graduate students work on problems like that, where they can see the value of what they're doing, they tend to be more motivated to do the hard stuff, even when it's leads to dead ends and so on. So I think that there's a really interesting tiered system of opportunities, starting with the startup. How do you encourage faculty members to not work with existing companies necessarily, but with new ventures in a way that helps their research to remain fresh,
Yeah.
current, relevant, impactful, all the way to the big companies. How do you think about what you deliver in the full picture, right? It's not just the technical bit, but the people that you're training, and you're, in some sense, training them together.
Yeah.
So, work in progress. I think this is a domain where we're making some investments to become better, but it's
Yeah.
still relatively early days.
I appreciate that. We could go on and on. I would like to bring it to a wrap and a few fun things. So, Lynden, what are your hobbies?
So I was a ping pong player in high school, and that still remains a hobby. I have a ping pong table in my basement. Not many people come play with me these days, but that is a lot of fun. I'm a gardener also, so I love to see things grow from nothing. And especially things that are hard to plant. So I love to plant eggplants. That is like one of the hardest things to grow in Ithaca because everything competes with you for your produce. So just doing that in a way that is, sustainable and all that has been. And I'm a birder, so I'm a really big fan of watching birds. You come to my yard and you'll see there are bird feeders of all shapes and size, and we just enjoy just looking through the window, even on a cold, snowy day, to see quite a variety of wildlife, bird life, bird life, no
I
squirrel
love
life,
it. I
bird
love
life
it.
at our feeders. So many hobbies, and I can't do them all at the same time, but they're all fun in their own time.
I love that. Okay. Introvert or extrovert? And I'll define introvert as deriving energy from within, extrovert deriving energy externally, not whether you're sociable or not.
I think I'm both, and I think my wife will tell you that too, because I do need I read a lot. I should have said that first because that's what I do most of my time. I like to read fiction, right? So that's been fun. I've been reading just, I know you have a big audience. I started on a journey just wanting to know, why is it people win the Nobel Prize for Literature? And so I started reading books by all the Nobel laureates, all of their books. I started that like maybe 7, 8 years ago. And it's just been a fascinating ride, Molly. So that's an aside, right? So I love reading. I get a lot of energy from being alone and private. But there's just something that happens when I interact with people like you. I just feel energized and sometimes surprised that I get that much energy.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that. So, one last thing. What might people, even your close friends, find surprising about you?
I don't know. Yeah, I think that I don't know. Yeah, so I make I love the New York Times recipes, and I used to cook one every Saturday. And I don't think I've got any close friends over to taste the products. So maybe they'll be
So,
surprised that is a Saturday pastime. But it's really fun to kind of create a dish and then perfect it, over
yeah.
time.
Okay, we're going to bring it home. Lynden, your proudest accomplishment could be work or personal.
So I would say the seamless transition to being dean and the impact that, I've been having actually on a 160-year-old organization in a relatively short time. It's remarkable how much we've gotten done in the
Yeah.
last 5+ years.
Yeah. And a huge tribute to your leadership, Lynden. So, in your next life, what profession would you be in?
I would be an engineer. I've learned to value engineers who are formally trained with the softer skills, right? To kind of understand leading teams. I developed much of that by experience and think that there is value in integrating that kind of thinking, that sort of um, 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 craft, of leading, of listening, of empowering people as a core part of a rounded technical experience for a student. And that, I would wish I had more of that so I can be maybe perhaps even more effective in roles like this.
Got it. Any nicknames that you could share with us?
Terrible. My name is Archer, and so I was Archie, like the cartoon Archie. And then Archie, there was a jughead, and my head was a little bit larger than normal, so I got that too. So I got many nicknames growing up, but none of them actually stuck, which isn't that the best thing?
Yeah, that's good. That's all good. Okay, your favorite food or cuisine?
So all over the map. I think that it goes from month to month. But right now, Greek cuisine is really just something very minimalist
Okay.
in terms of ingredients and preparation, but just I don't know how they do it with freshness and taste and just wholesomeness.
Nice. Nice. Okay, so you shared a lot. Do you have a particular, having listened to yourself, a particular top takeaway?
It's a journey. I think that I've been reflecting on what I've been saying to you, and just thinking about conversations I've had with other leaders. And they're similar journeys where there are threads that perhaps you couldn't weave them in isolation, but once you're at the destination, you can look back to see how foundational stuff as a child, right? Someone tapping you on the shoulder and make you the leader of a class. So that ultimately, in an interesting way, defines what's possible.
Yeah. And you have been very generous with what you shared. What was it like for you, Lyndon, to share your journey with us today?
Well, Molly, just easy because of you, because I think that we've had similar types of conversations. I think your readers, your listeners, are probably going to think, "Gosh, this is a very long-winded dean," but in reality, it's because you bring out, this reflective aspect in me. And so this was fun.
It was really fun for me. I have to thank you, Lynden, for all that you do. I appreciate you. I appreciate how you are part of the solution, right? Helping us all be safe, seen and heard, and our true and our very best selves. I will see you soon. I am here to serve in any way that I can be a little bit helpful to you. I am always there for you. So thank you
Uh,
for joining me.
Molly, absolutely, and thank you. And the book is awesome. So
Yay.
you're already helping.
Yes, that's great. That's great.
All
You
right,
take
take care.
you take good care. Folks, Lynden is a leader of leaders, using his voice skillfully and creating the collective communication for everyone to win. I want to help you do the same. Check out Marshall Goldsmith's and my best-selling book and the Say It Skillfully 101 program to use your voice with clarity, compassion, and confidence. And my final thought from Lynden, closed doors provide direction too. And that's a
Absolutely.
wrap, folks. Thanks for joining us. Please be part of the solution and kindly share this show. Amplify Lynden's voice, reflect on your top takeaways, and know I'm cheering for you to be who you are and say what needs to be said skillfully so that you and those around you create the shared reality that makes work and life so much better.
Say It Skillfully is finding your authentic voice and knowing how and when best to use it with clarity, compassion, and confidence. Most communication and personal development preach playing the game, so you win. Say It Skillfully teaches you how to change the game, so relationships strengthen, performance improves, and everyone wins.